to take a few minutes, and I invite you to close your eyes as well with me, just to focus on being here right now. So we've probably had a very busy morning to get to this point, and we've taken some time out of your day to do this. So let's just take a minute just to really arrive in this moment now, and then we can really focus and think about our pelvic floors for the next sort of 45 minutes. So I'll invite you just to close your eyes, and then just to start focus on your breath. So you can just stay with your eyes open if that's more comfortable, if that feels safer. But just to start to take a few breaths in and out through the nose. See whether you can relax those shoulders a little bit. And also focus on relaxing the breath as well. So we're just going to release any tension through the belly. And then just take a few moments just to scan the whole body, just to really notice your body in this space, wherever you are now. Just to kind of have a little scan, just to see how it's feeling, kind of like a check-in. Back of the head feels nice and long as those shoulders relax down. So a few more breaths, so just focusing on the in and the out breath. That's it. And then just gently opening the eyes, coming back into our little space. So it's just a little simple exercise just to bring us all back into the present moment. There's a bit of mindfulness. Okay, so we'll get started. And that was as much for me as it was for you, just to get me settled. So I hope that was all right. So yeah, I'm going to tell you about me, and I'm going to tell you my history of pelvic floor health. And then I'm going to talk to you about how I rehabilitated my pelvic floor. And then more about that approach, the full body approach that I now teach. So, and then at the end, there's going to be time. So I'm going to talk about sort of 20 to 25 minutes, and then give you time at the end to ask some questions. So I've got some questions that a few of you have sent here. So if questions come up, then if you can see the chat box at the bottom, then just pop your questions in there, or is it in the Q&A? Might be in the Q&A section. Yeah, pop it in the Q&A section if that's there, or the chat, whichever, and I'll have a look at the end and answer any questions and the ones that I've got here. And okay, so we'll get started. I think that was everything. Yeah, brilliant. And I'm going to do a little poll in a minute. So in fact, let's start with the poll, because it'd be good to see who you are, sort of how many what you're kind of here for at the moment. So I've just launched that poll. So it's a little bit about you. So, well, I've not launched it yet, actually. So let me just launch that. So if you just take a moment just to let me know if you're here because you're currently experiencing problems, or you're here to get information, which you might be a health professional as well, and just kind of learn a bit more about it. Brilliant. So at the moment, you've got about 20 more seconds to give you a little bit of a timer. 83% of you are here because you're experiencing pelvic floor problems. Yeah, and some of you, 17%, are here because for whatever reason, you've not experienced any problems. Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. So 83% of you are here because you're experiencing pelvic floor problems. So I'm glad that you're here today. That very much fits with the national statistic and statistics that I've done for market research, that it's usually about 80% of women do experience pelvic floor issues at some stage in their life, at any age. So it's such an important subject, and it's so common for many women, that it's important to kind of look after your pelvic floor health, and that's why I specialize in it. So about me. So I've already said I'm a yoga teacher, and I specialize in pelvic floor health. before that, as well as I have a 18-year-long career in marketing as well. So I've worked in charities, in schools, in mostly services, working in a marketing-based role. Now, that has meant that I've been sitting down for around about 15 years. So throughout most of my 20s and all of my 30s, I've had a sit-down job where I've been sitting over a computer, very stationary, very sedentary job, very sedentary lifestyle. So that I'll come back to that. So just gives you a bit of a history about where what I've been doing with my body, which is very important for pelvic floor health. Prior to that, as a child, I spent my youth dancing, going to dance classes, in shows, exams, performances, things like that. So had a very, very active childhood, was naturally always very flexible. So always tended to kind of push myself beyond that flexibility limit. So all sort of up until I was kind of 20, was very active. And then once I kind of hit my 20s, when you get a job, then I started just sitting down for around about 8 hours a day, even more, because then you get home and sit on the sofa and things like that. And that becomes relevant later down the line. So that's kind of me. I've been teaching yoga for 3 years. I qualified 4 years ago, qualified just before I gave birth to my son. And so I am a mum, and my son is now 3.5. So I was pregnant at the end of my first teacher training, and then kind of took maternity leave and started teaching in the community after that. So I've been teaching for around about 3 years. Now, I came to pelvic floor health having had quite a history of pelvic floor issues. And I say, well, quite a history. I say kind of a long history, because I'd say my pelvic floor problems started even before I had children. I think there's a common perception that your pelvic floor will be weak after you've had children, and that's that. And that's just, it's just a circumstance of having children, so put up with it. And actually, when I started to think about it, I looked back to, my 20s and 30s, and I always had, and I would describe it, well, frequent trips to the toilet was my thing. And I didn't at the time even think that was a pelvic floor problem. It wasn't even on my radar at that age, in my 20s and early 30s. But I know that I was one of those that the kind of just in case wheeze, if before I went into a meeting, I'd have a wee. When I came out of a meeting, I'd have a wee. Before I caught a bus, I'd have a wee just in case. And actually, I picked up that habit from my mum, who I think probably also had pelvic floor problems, because she kind of taught me really to always go for a wee before you leave the house, always go for a wee when you're right, she was always going to the toilet, and she's not around anymore, so I can't actually ask her about it. But I think a lot about, her symptoms. And I, have these sort of very vivid memories of her. She'd cough, and she kind of, we hold ourselves if you have a cough or you sneeze so that you don't wee yourself, that kind of thing. And that made me think, oh gosh, yeah, I think she probably did have pelvic floor problems. And I think I had pelvic floor problems as well when I was younger, but didn't really think about it because it didn't really start to it wasn't affecting me. I could always go to the toilet. It wasn't really an issue, didn't affect me at all. So it wasn't until after the birth of my child when I became very much more aware of it, because of the birth of my son was, I guess, a little bit traumatic. I don't feel like it was mentally traumatic really, but for my body it was quite tough. I had an episiotomy, I had a forceps delivery, had a 24-hour labour, so it was a little bit challenging, and had to have lots of medical support because my fats all sort of started to decline. So there was a lot of disconnect, I think, after my pregnancy, and I just felt like the whole area down below, I just felt so disconnected from it, couldn't feel it anymore. And I think that's probably quite common. Couldn't feel it, couldn't connect with it. So then I became quite panicking, knowing that I'm one of those just in case wees. Well, I lost that ability to kind of know if I needed a wee, just in the, in the early stages of recovering from birth. it was, you know, still very numb. The muscle engagement just wasn't there at all. And so I went to the toilet even more, and it just became exaggerated to the point where I started to worry about going to the shop, my local shop, which is a 20-minute walk, in case I needed a wee, because it started to, you know, I was panicking and I was worrying and getting really anxious about it. So, you know, I was out for, you know, as a new mum, out with my baby in the pram, and you know, I started to think, I don't want this. This is not right. This is making me feel rubbish. It's making me feel old and like, you know, I'm just completely lost control and lost my confidence in my pelvic floor. And the only advice I was given from the midwives, which by the way are brilliant and helped me and my son come into the world and for me to stay alive. But the only advice I was given was to kind of, you know, do your Kegels, which is the squeeze and release, the kind of, you know, that kind of gripping, squeezing, strength training that we're told to do. And that was it. I was sent on my way, and I was kind of just sitting there going, this is strange. I shouldn't be, you know, this isn't sort of normal. I'm not happy with it. So I went to the doctors. The doctors sent me to a continence nurse, which made me feel even older. So I was like, oh right, okay, so I'm now in that category, am I? That continence thing. And she gave me the same prescription as the Kegels, the squeezers. They didn't really do any sort of any good to me. I think in the early days they did help me to reconnect. So I you know, eventually started to feel the muscles tightening, because in early stages I was like, I can't feel anything. You might be at that stage now, whether you have a child or not, you might not actually know what's squeezing, and that's quite normal to not even know what's happening. Couple of things that she did do though was really useful, and that was to check to see whether I was emptying my bladder fully, because one of my complaints was that I always felt like I needed a wee. So was I actually emptying my bladder? And she tested for that. And that was a challenge in itself. I had to go to the nurse without going to the toilet before I went in, which was all strange, because I'd go to the toilet normally before an appointment. And she tested all that, and I was emptying my bladder. So I started to think, okay, that's cool. I am emptying my bladder. So maybe my body is working more than I realised. Maybe it's somewhere in the mind, or, you know, maybe I'm getting stressed about it. So then where? So she gave me a kind of prescription, really, I suppose, for doing Kegels daily. I had to do so many long ones and then short ones, do that 3 times a day, go back, check it. The strength in my pelvic floor, what was good was she did an internal examination, was okay. It was all right. She said it was okay. Fine. You know, nothing to worry about. That was the kind of thing that she came back with. So I was like, okay. So for a little bit, I felt happy. I felt relaxed. I thought, yeah, oh, that's it then. I'm glad I went. I'm glad I've got myself sorted. But then it just came back. Like after sort of a few days of thinking, yeah, that's okay. Then I just started to notice that I still need a wee. I felt like I always needed a wee. Sometimes it was worse. Sometimes it was okay. I'd have days where I think, it's okay. I'm cured. And then other days it'd just feel rubbish again. And then I'd feel stressed about it. So that's when I started to do a bit more research, and I felt like that this isn't a normal thing to happen to a body. It might be quite common, but it's not something that I'm just going to accept. I had a young child. I didn't want to kind of grow up, or him to grow up being, sort of seeing me always dashing to the toilet. And I just thought, no, I want to be able to do all the things I want to do. I want to go on a long walk. I want to jump around. I want to feel confident that I don't always have to need the toilet or be near the toilet. So that's when I started researching. And I think because of my interest in or the body through teaching yoga and learning yoga, that's when I started to look into body mechanics and the way our body moves, the way our muscles move, and the relationship between different muscles, and how we all need to work. The whole body needs to kind of be functioning well to for everything to be functioning well. So when there's pain in one area, it could be a cause of something else. And I know I was always very fascinated by going to physios, because the whole thing of being able to fix yourself by strengthening somewhere or stretching somewhere, and that became that sort of became my kind of real interest. And then I kind of stumbled upon this course to actually train to be a pelvic floor health specialist, or exercise specialist, which I thought, well, fab, I'll do that. I'll take myself through the course. I would then qualify as an expert kind of specialist. But I thought this could be really it. So I started reading into it and reading about the person who was running the course, and thought, yeah, this sounds like the thing that's been missing, because I've been to the nurses, I've been to the doctors, and they've not helped me. I've done the squeezers, and I started to read a little bit more about the Kegels that are prescribed. So this is where it all started. So I started to learn about the mechanics of the body, and particularly the pelvic floor. So one of the things that I learned sort of more or less straight away was that the Kegels aren't always the answer, and aren't the right thing for everybody. So what a Kegel, a squeeze and release, does essentially is it's a strengthening exercise. So it's strengthening your muscle, the pelvic floor, to be stronger. That's kind of what it does. There's a few flaws, pardon the pun, in that exercise. One is the fact that it was developed in 1945 by a man called Arnold Kegel. So we've learned a lot more about the body since the 1940s, haven't we? And we haven't updated our knowledge as we apply it to pelvic floor health, which was one thing that I immediately thought, hang on a minute, we're still teaching this one exercise from the 1940s, and we haven't factored in all the other things that now, how we live our lives now, because we live our lives so much more differently than we did in the 1940s. We are much more sedentary, we sit down a lot more, our lifestyle has changed. So for me, that's when it became really clear that it was just had to be more than just the squeezers. In amongst the training that I was doing, I went to see a women's health physio, which was amazing. So she was qualified in specific, pelvic floor, women's health, all of that area. So it's so good to go to a specialist, which there are some around, but there's very few that really specialize in this. And she was able to do some really thorough testing of my pelvic floor to see how strong it was. And what she sort of diagnosed was that it was strong. It was strong. So I was like, hooray, that's really exciting. So I've been doing all my Kegels, it's strong. But the problem was, it was tight. It was overactive. So actually, by doing those strengthening muscles, and I probably did get slightly obsessed, because I tend to, if I think, oh, this is going to help me, I'll do it more and more. It had got to the point where it was so tight that it couldn't release. So I'll tell you a bit more about the pelvic floor muscle in how it works, and why this is really important. Because the pelvic floor muscle is it's sort of two main things about it in terms of how it works. It's anticipatory muscle, and it's an automatic muscle. So it works automatically with your body to anticipate the needs of your body. So, for example, when you breathe in, naturally your pelvic floor will relax. When you breathe out, your pelvic floor naturally contracts. Now, if the pelvic floor doesn't have the space to move or to do its job properly, if that pelvic floor is always in this tight position, you can imagine that that's going to then inhibit the ability of the bladder to fully empty, to fully kind of sit in its correct place. And it's going to mean that it's going to fatigue quite quickly as well. So if it's always tight, so if you spend a whole day in a bicep curl like that, you wouldn't be able to unless you were I don't think you'd be able to. Your muscle would get tired after a while. Or if you were, the more realistic, if you were carrying a bag all day, your muscles get tired, your arms would fatigue, particularly if you were kind of holding it out here and really expecting the arm to take this load. And that's essentially what was happening in my body. It was tight and overactive. But when I asked it to do its job of not leaking wee or you know, to hold my bladder to kind of more of a normal length of time, it was going, I can't, and it would, you know, I just can't do it, and you're going to have to go for a wee, or you know, and there was a couple of, I only ever had a couple of occurrences where I did leak a bit of wee as well, which was, you know, another bit of a shock, another bit of, this is really stressful. So it all started to become clear. And I'm so glad I went to a women's health physio, because it gave me that starting point to really understand what was happening. So I knew my pelvic floor was strong. So sometimes it's not always weakness, sometimes it is, but it was tight, and I had to work on that releasing. So another thing that became really clear about the pelvic floor is that ultimately there's you know, if we're experiencing pelvic floor issues, we're experiencing a level of dysfunction in the body. And dysfunction means that there's weakness, there's tightness, that something is not working properly. So that doesn't necessarily mean it's the pelvic floor that's not working properly. I shall bring in my very special model. So here's my lovely pelvis, and the red bits are the pelvic floor muscles. So when you start to look at this, and if you think about where this is in our body, this is kind of right in the center of our body. So it's pretty crucial, isn't it, to what we're doing, so, or to how we live our lives. So ultimately, the pelvic floor muscles here are supporting everything that sits above. So immediately they're supporting the pelvic organs, so our bladder, our bowel, our uterus, and then as you go up, all of this everything that sits above it, so the rib cage, the diaphragm, the way the diaphragm works kind of in relation to the pelvic floor, and the body and the shoulders and the head, there's so much stacked up above it. So you've got all of this down, you know, all of this kind of, the responsibility of your whole skeleton is kind of landing right down here on your pelvic floor. So it kind of starts to think, gosh, yeah, no, you know, that's quite an important job that pelvic floor's got, and you know, we need to give it the best chance possible. And then you go, so what's supporting the pelvic floor are ultimately your bottom, which is sitting the back here, so your lovely glute muscles, and then your legs, so your quads, your hamstrings, your knees, your calves, your feet are the foundations of your pelvic floor. So what helped me specifically? Just great, lovely. I've got some questions coming in. Got super distracted then. So I love some questions. So how I started to work was I started with realigning my body, and it was my whole body. So I wasn't at all even bothering with the squeeze and releases. I kind of just put those to one side because I knew they weren't helpful to me, and they were actually making things worse. You know, you can't make something stronger. You're just going to make it weak and make it tight, and it's not going to work. So I started realigning, and I started by working with my feet. Particularly worked with my mobilizing my big toes, to see whether I could lift my big toes independently, and that was quite an interesting exercise in itself, because suddenly when your brain asks your big toes to lift, you go, oh, I don't know if I can actually just lift my big toes and leave the rest of the toes on the floor. With that, so started to realign, and then looked at my whole posture. So I'll come back to the fact that I spent most of my 20s, all of my 30s, which when I added it up a couple of days ago, I thought, yeah, it really was all of my 30s. So, you know, for 10 or more years, sat down in a sit-down job, because I was kind of 38-ish when I started teaching yoga. So, you know, my career became a bit more active then. So, you know, almost all of my 30s and 20s spent sitting down. Now, what sitting down does to the lovely pelvis is tucks it under. So here's our pelvis in its nice neutral position, and when we're sort of the way we're, you know, our factory settings, the way we kind of come out, the way we're born, our pelvis is in a beautiful neutral position. Now, over time, your body will adapt to the position that you put it in the most. And now if that's sitting for you, that's going to tuck your pelvis under. Now then, that puts strain on other parts of the body. So the pelvic floor isn't then, it's kind of tilted up here. You're putting strain potentially on your lower back. Your diaphragm isn't mirroring the pelvic floor anymore, so can't work as it should do to kind of support that breathing mechanism that helps the pelvic floor function. And all of the rest of the body becomes out of alignment. So it's really important to start working on the legs, the way we stand, the way we stack our body, essentially the way we stack our bones, in order to get this pelvis to slowly and magically come into neutral. And that's our kind of ultimate goal, is to get this pelvis in a neutral position, and you can tell that neutral position on yourself, because these are your kind of pointy hip bones. So that your pointy hip bones are facing forwards. They're not kind of tucked under. So if I was to tuck under and tilt back, then my pelvis, my hip bones will be pointing up to the ceiling. If I was to stick them out, so some people do have they're tilting their pelvis that way as well. So if you've got quite a flexible back, your lumbar spine is quite flexible, then this again is going to cause your pelvic floor, or not cause, but not allow your pelvic floor to function. And that's the difference. It's not the causes that we're so much interested in. It's about enabling your pelvic floor to be in the exact right environment to work, which is this neutral pelvis. So started with alignment, and alignment is about posture. It's about standing well. It's about getting the rib cage dropping down so that so we're not kind of thrusting out. We can breathe correctly. It's about length and back of the head. So we're feeling like we're in a really strong alignment and feeling really strong from, the way that we were intended to be. And that in itself can take time, because if, I've spent like 10, 12 years doing in this, I'm not suddenly going to be able to go like this, because my body's going to go, no, you can't just expect me to do that when you've told me to do this for 12 years. So this takes time. It's very much like 10% changes every day, trying to make those different changes to realign the pelvis, and working on it, constantly working on that alignment to get it like that. And it will eventually go back to kind of how it was, but it may even take just as long to get back, 12 years. I hope not. I feel like it's made a lot of progress. Then the other thing for me was to stretch tight muscles. Now, I thought that I was quite flexible all over, because I have hypermobile joints. So you might have hypermobile joints as well. One of the ways of telling is if your elbows kind of hyperextend. So if you've got, you notice that your bones will, go a little bit further. But what I realized is that my body's been overcompensating. So there's certain joints in my body that are hypermobile, and which have been working instead of the muscles stretching instead. So I went through a process of, particularly my hamstrings were very tight, my calves were very tight, which I didn't notice, because actually instead of doing, a hamstring stretch, so when you've got your feet out in front and you kind of do this hamstring stretch, I was able to get all the way, down to the knees in a yoga class, for example. But it wasn't because of my hamstrings. It was because my pelvis was, my hips were fairly mobile and actually a little bit unstable. Were able just to go and tilt and allow me to do it. So my back was just actually flexing down rather than the hamstrings working. So I was fooled into thinking that I was, more flexible than I was. And actually, when I started to focus on actively stretching things like the hamstrings and releasing tension through the calves, then that's when I started to notice a difference, because it started to release the body. It started to reset it back into those, I keep saying factory settings, but I quite like that, because if you look at a child, if you've got a young person around, or you remember having a young person around, the way their feet naturally, if they're young still, their feet will point forwards. Their feet don't turn out. You might notice about your own walking is your feet tend to turn out generally, or might turn in. You might even, stand to one side. So we've got this kind, and you sort of stand on one hip. Children will stand without the need to prop themselves up to lean on something, because they've got the strength, they've got the alignment, their skeleton is working, their frame is working as it should do. And it's only over time, when we start to sit down more and we start to get a job and we start to go like this, that we start to lose the function in the body. And that might show up also in things like back pain, knee pain, things like that. So stretching tight muscles, insides of the thighs was really quite essential to stretch out. And then the final piece of the puzzle, the final piece was kind of strengthening weak muscles. And one of the big areas for me was my glutes. So bring in the model again. So the glutes that are sitting here on the back of the pelvis are essentially the main muscles that are going to keep your pelvis in position. I had what you might kind of almost jokingly call as like a flat bottom syndrome. My bottom was totally flat because I'd spent so long sitting down in a conventional chair. My glutes had just become inactive, they'd become weak. So when I come to kind of walk or do anything with them, they weren't firing as they should do. They were still working, but they weren't doing the main job of keeping the pelvis as it was. And as a result of that, I experienced pelvic pain, and especially towards the end of my pregnancy, had pelvic girdle pain, because my pelvis was so unstable. And if I'd have kind of known that before I'd got pregnant or through the pregnancy, I would have definitely been working on my glute muscles to keep that pelvis as it was. And I just didn't. It just wasn't an area of the body that I really thought about. I didn't know about the glutes. I just went to the gym and did squats a little bit. But when you compare that to spending 8 hours sitting down at a desk, it's nothing compared to two sets of 10 reps at a gym 3 times a week. It's absolutely nothing at all. So glute strength was absolutely critical. On top of that was learning how to breathe. So I've mentioned about the rib cage placement, but also being able to expand the rib cage as I breathed in, and let the rib cage go back. So breathing mechanics is really essential, because one of my issues was anxiety, and I know that it was almost like a vicious circle. The more stressed I got about my pelvic floor, the more anxious I got, and the more I was breathing up here. And when you're breathing up here, your pelvic floor isn't working. Essentially, it might just be just hovering on that super tight or overactive, so it's not able to relax when it needs to relax. So learning how to breathe really helped me manage my pelvic floor, and learning how to then release tension. So yeah, I mean, and essentially I've been working on that sort of, that's my full body approach, been working on that, and I always work on that, and now incorporate that into how I teach yoga, whether you're somebody with a pelvic floor problem or not, because actually looking at the way our whole body functions, and working on strength and stretching and alignment all together is really going to help. Because sometimes we might just focus just on stretching the body, and that's where yoga wasn't actually it was sometimes harmful to me, because I was overstretching certain areas where I actually needed to build strength and wasn't getting the muscle strength. So yoga's brilliant for stretching if you're quite stiff and quite tight, but if you're already flexible, or your body's not functioning well, then you can overstretch, and you can be stretching or moving the wrong bit. So that kind of leads me on to talking a little bit about the full body approach that I now teach, and I teach that in as an 8-week course that I'm currently in the middle of, the first one of that, and that's brilliant. It's going really great for the group of women that are with me. That's what we work on. We work over 8 weeks. We work on mobilizing the feet, stretching the calves, looking at the whole alignment, learning how the body needs to be stacked in order to help the pelvic floor. And then we kind of work all the way up through to shoulder mobility. We work on hip strength. We work on strengthening the glutes, which is a big one. So we learn a really simple squat to really get those glutes working and get you used to bringing the mind into the body and getting that body working like it should do. And we look at neck position. So, you know, this kind of, I realized I was jutting my head forward a lot, and it's a common thing. So if you're doing that now to concentrate, just tuck that head back a little bit. So on top of, so we do all of that over an 8-week period. On top of that is the kind of lifestyle factors as well, which I'll just touch upon a little bit because, you know, it's already nearly 11:45. So I want to just get to those questions, and I don't want to keep anyone over an hour. Things like, there's a whole raft of things on top of the way your skeleton is working and your muscles inside of your skeleton is, or on top of your skeleton is working, are the lifestyle factors. So I've already talked a lot about sitting, and sitting, it's kind of like, I've heard some movement specialists refer to it as the new smoking. It's potentially very damaging to the body if we sit in the same position, because we're not asking the body to work, we're not asking the muscles of the body to work. And that's why I asked you at the beginning just to think about either standing up or sitting on the floor, or varying the position that you're in, because the solution to sitting too much isn't standing too much either, because if you stood for 8 hours you would equally get problems with your body, because it's just, the body needs variety, it needs diversity, it needs to move, it needs to be used, and it isn't if we're sitting. Overstretching I've talked about, so that can, you know, potentially overstretching muscles, so you're going too far. You know, a muscle needs to be at its a premium sort of strength and length to be able to work well, and you don't need to overstretch something in order for it to work. And things like tight clothing. So one of the things I gave up was my lovely skinny jeans, because what that does is puts pressure into your abdomen, and that pressure, a little bit like a balloon, it's either going to go down or it's going to go up, and most likely, and up, you know, that's when you kind of get your hernia problems, but down, just putting pressure on the pelvic floor. So wearing those tight jeans was kind of scrapped, which was a little bit of a, oh no, I love the skinny jeans. But then when you realize it's actually affecting your health and making me go to the loo a lot, then it was very easy to kind of give it up. And yeah, and wearing barefoot shoes, wearing heeled shoes, positive heel shoes. So any shoes that have even little small heels on them can impact the way the body works, the way the body moves. So it's all of these things that I talk about in my 8-week course, that we kind of work through. And it's, you know, so it's lifestyle, it's breathing, it's stretching, realignment, and strengthening as well. So that's kind of how to tackle pelvic floor problems. And it's all about a pelvic floor, it's all about a full body approach. It's not just about doing that exercise. So we started talking at the beginning about just strengthening one muscle. Hopefully you can see now that this muscle almost, you know, it needs us to look at the whole body, because it's here going, I'm doing everything. And I feel like the pelvic floor is so essential. You know, we're all here in this world because of our lovely, somebody else's pelvis. And, you know, we might have had children, or we might not have had children. That's the other thing, that it's, you know, we can have pelvic floor problems without having children. We can have them before children, we can have them even if we haven't had children, or if we've had them ages ago. It's not about having children, it's not about just what happened in that birth scenario. It's about the, you know, if you've spent 8 years sitting down for 8 hours a day, like I spent all that time, then your body's just going to say, well, I can't work properly, you're not really giving me the right environment to work. And that's what it's all about, looking at the whole environment that you're putting that lovely pelvic floor in. So that's my story. That's how to tackle pelvic floor health in a nutshell. So I'm going to go on to some questions, because I've got some lovely comments here. Let's going to have a So let's have a look. Yeah, so I'm just going to read this out because this is good sort of background. It's similar. Yeah, I can kind of see. So I've got someone saying that they've been diagnosed with prolapse. So they've got bladder and bowel prolapse diagnosis, had a second baby, which had a baby that was 11.5 pounds. Second baby was 9 pounds and a forceps delivery. So yeah, similar to me, I've just had one baby, but a forceps delivery. Been advised to do Kegels and not to exercise. I've been told I have strong muscles, so it's not a problem, and I've been told I need an operation. So you can see I am a bit confused as to which route to take. Kegels don't work for me. It's been getting worse for 20 years. Yeah. So that's the thing. So thank you for that. So that's kind of gives us a bit of an insight into different, because everyone's unique and has a different kind of history in that. So I can see immediately if you've already got strong muscles, which is fab. So doing Kegel exercises, that's not going to help you because you don't need to overstrength. You don't need to keep strengthening that muscle. What you need to do is start to learn how to release it. And there's a lot of beautiful releasing exercises. We look at releasing things like the psoas muscle as well. That kind of runs from the back all the way through to kind of front of the hips. It runs quite deep, and that can be tight if we've sat a lot because it kind of links into the the hips. So the hip flexors can be tight, the psoas muscle can be tight. That in turn inhibits the body's ability to be able to stand up. So if these are your legs and this is your body sitting down, so that's your knees. When you ask it to stand up, if your muscles running through it are tight, it's almost like they're on a real tight elastic almost, then they're not going to enable you to do this, to stand up straight. So this is your body, these are your legs, if that works as an example. So you need to kind of learn how to release, and that takes time. And the muscle needs a little bit of time to release as well. Even within one moment of doing an exercise, you can get more release of a muscle if you spend 15 minutes just holding a specific well-guided release exercise. But please don't hold stretch exercises for 15 minutes. They need to be kind of well-guided. So really, the way I work is not, and then the same person just commented saying, I'm literally doing everything wrong, or bless you. But it's what you don't know that it's wrong, do you? And you're not, you don't know until you start thinking about these things and start layering all the bits of knowledge that we now know on top of that. And one of the things I've been doing some research since my experience of going to the doctors and the nurses was actually I read the NICE guidelines that obviously advise your GPs and your nurses on what to offer you as a treatment. And their guidelines are very limited. They offer the Kegel exercise, so the strengthening the pelvic floor. They suggest looking at what's it called? Reducing your caffeine intake. That might not even be a problem. It might be. I mean, it's an obvious cause. I know cause of going to the toilet more because it's diuretic. That's not really, about the long-term effects of the pelvic floor. You know that if you've had a coffee, then you are likely to be in the loo a few times afterwards because it's, it's a diuretic. That's going to happen to most people. There's lots of foods and drinks that are naturally diuretic. That's their advice, is to kind of reduce your caffeine. One is to lose weight. Again, not particularly helpful because what is the right weight for you? We're all different. We all have different frames and different skeletons, and what might be right in a book for somebody isn't right for somebody else. And that's it. And then after that advice, the advice is then surgery. And surgery, it even says in the guidelines that it's not 100% effective. So I think if you can look at all of these factors, there's so many things that you can actually do yourself at home by changing things like the way the shoes that you wear, the clothes that you wear. It sounds like a total makeover, doesn't it? But it's small changes, step-by-step changes, looking at wearing flatter shoes, clothes that give you a little bit more space, that don't limit your movement, that allow you to sit on the floor comfortably. sit on the floor more, realign the body. All of these things that you can kind of layer on top start to open up the body so it can work, so that that dysfunction starts to become function, and we start to be able to function really well again. I've got another question saying that what are the causes of urge incontinence, and is it common for them to be intermittent? So before I do that, I'm just going to launch another poll, which just to ask you, see where my next poll is, your specific problems. So if you wouldn't mind, just I'm going to launch this poll, see whether those of you that said you've got problems, just to let me know, there we go, how you would describe your pelvic floor problems. And I think you can tick, a few if you feel like you've got a few. I'll give that 30 seconds. So we've got at the moment 50% urge incontinence, 50% prolapse, pelvic floor weakness, yeah. Lower back pain, yeah, that's interesting, but yeah, definitely one that's very common, because as you can see from the pelvis, this lower back, you know, your spine is here, your lower back just kind of essentially here. So we've got, yeah, 75% of you are saying prolapse, and then it's kind of urge incontinence is the next one. So urge incontinence, if that's not something you suffer with but you're interested in knowing, urge incontinence is the kind of the urgency to go to the loo, so not being able to hold, you know, once your brain tells you that you need a wee, then, or a poo, then you immediately need to go and do that, and there's that urgency that you can't do it. I'm saying they need a wee now. Oh bless. Yeah, breathe. It doesn't solve straight away, but yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that. Thanks everyone for doing that. So we've got a mix, probably more slightly higher on the prolapse and urge incontinence. So stress incontinence is the other one, which is when you're jumping and you might leak a bit of wee or a little leak a bit of poo. So that's kind of when you're sneezing, coughing, laughing, anything, jumping, and then general pelvic pain can be, you know, caused at any time in your life. Sometimes that's through instability. So yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that. Thank you for your answers. That's really good to see, or, you know, useful to have that spectrum, and for you to sort of know that there's such a wide variety of different dysfunctions. People always have different combinations of a similar thing. So yes, go back to my question, which was what are the causes of urge incontinence, and is it common to be intermittent? So my role as a movement specialist isn't really about sort of diagnosing the cause as such. It's to look at how the body's moving now, and to see it, and to see the body, and to actually then start to kind of, you know, realign it and start to rehabilitate the body, and therefore the pelvic floor. But the causes are something that you can probably think about. You know, if you could even think about keeping a bit of a diary. So if it's something that's intermittent, are there times that you have been doing something and then it's intermittent? So for example, if you've had a whole day sitting down, and maybe on top of that you're wearing some tight jeans all that day, and then the next day you're trying to just go for a walk or something, and you just feel like that, you know, that urgency has returned, then maybe the pelvic floor hasn't been in the best environment for that little bit of that bit of time. So I'd say the intermittent thing is usually because of the way that your lifestyle. Maybe you're feeling anxious and you're holding your breath, or you're not breathing as you need to. So I definitely look at, has anything changed? Have you changed the way you were living? So if it was fine before, and I can definitely sympathize with that as well, because that was something for me that, you know, it was intermittent. Some days it would be absolutely fine, some days it wouldn't be, and for some reason, if I needed, if I was anxious about something, then then it would be worse. And the anxiety, because I wasn't breathing, because I was holding tension in my abdomen, was causing pressure on the pelvic floor and therefore causing pressure on the bladder and making me feel like I needed a wee more. So there was also mention of not emptying your bowel properly, and that affects, so that's going to affect how that feels on the bladder. So if the bowel hasn't emptied properly, then that's going to push into the bladder, especially if there's a prolapse. And that's something, you know, quite common if you're constipated or not emptying properly. And there's a thing called the squatty potty, which you might have heard of or not, but Google it. And it's essentially this stool that you can kind of place underneath the toilet. And all it does is brings your legs up. So your legs are up like this. So you're essentially in a squat. So you can do the same with some books either side of the toilet to enable the bowel to actually empty properly. So there's things that you can do there. Someone's got a squatty potty. Hurrah, that's exciting. No. Okay, yeah, it might not cope with a prolapse. Yeah, so you might need to look at realigning and sort of strengthening muscles rather than using the squatty potty. Okay, so I've got a few more questions. Can men have pelvic floor problems? My husband has major abdominal surgery and now has to urinate about every 45 minutes. Yeah, they can, absolutely. What it does is push down onto the prostate and will cause more frequency in weeing. And abdominal surgery, I'm not an expert at all because I'm a movement teacher rather than a medic, but that says to me that there's something changed there in the abdomen in terms of maybe the pressure, the tension, the muscle balance, could be his frame. Without, obviously, I'm not kind of diagnosing or anything or giving you a prescription for what's going to be, but yeah, definitely men can do it. It's less common, it's less talked about, and there's even less sort of help obviously out there. But the way I work in the full body approach would work for a man as well. It's just that I'm a woman and I know it from my perspective. But yeah, I feel sorry for men in a way because there's even less out there. There's not that much for women in terms of support if you're through pregnancy, childbirth, menopause. There's not an awful lot of support, so, and even less for men. But yeah, it could be there is a dysfunction there essentially. Best to, first thing, go to the doctors and make sure it's not anything else. But yeah, full body approach, realigning, strengthening, stretching, etc. So is there a way to sit in a chair that keeps the pelvis in neutral alignment? Yes, there is. And I'm just wondering if I can quickly show you, if people wanted to stay on, I'm going to show you, but it just means a little bit of moving around. So yeah, ultimately, I'm going to show you. Let's show you now. So I'm going to give you a little tour of, so I've just been sitting, on a yoga block all this time to kind of keep my pelvis in neutral. So I'm going to get this, so this is a kind of standard office chair. Now, hopefully you can kind of see the bottom half of me, which is what you need to do. And you can see I'm wearing nice stretchy pants as well. So normal way we kind of sit in a chair might be like this. So you can see that the pelvis is tucked under. And even sort of sitting upright, my pelvis is quite tucked. So, my feet are nice and firmly on the floor. The best way to do it is keep the feet hip distance apart. So the knees and feet. Sit more on the edge of the chair. And the way to sort of see where it is to do a few tilts, sort of tipping it under, tilting it out like that. And then to just basically sort of move it forward. So we end up sitting quite far forward on the chair. Now, depending on your hip mobility here and the length of your legs in relation to the chair, that might not to the floor, that might not be that comfortable. So what you can do is add any number or any height of props. Now the cushion or anything just needs to prop just underneath the sit bone, so the bony bits of the pelvis, to lift it up a little bit. So I'm not sitting right on top of it. I'm allowing that just to prop my sitting bones up. So that gives me a little bit of a prop. So the sitting bones are here. So I'm just propping that part of my pelvis up. Another thing you can do is get something even higher, so to sit on. So your feet are firmly on the floor. This is nice because it gives my hips a bit more space here, and we can really kind of keep that pelvis. You almost you can't actually like that. It's very difficult for me to tuck it under. The only danger is that I might end up sort of sticking it out a bit. So just be careful of bringing those ribs in a little bit. So you can see they're thrusting the rib cage out is not good. We want to keep the ribs in as well. So that's kind of sitting neutral. So hopefully that's given you a few tips, because yeah, it's not always convenient to kind of sit on the floor if you're working somewhere, or you know, on the bus or something. We can't always sit on the floor, or we can't always stand and have a bit of a stretch. So I hope that's helped. Yeah, so the next final question. So I've got pronounced lordosis and bowel prolapse. Can these be helped? Yeah, is a simple question. Yeah, lordosis is the well, you've got a very flexible lumbar spine. Is that right? Am I right in thinking that? I've got the right term there. If that's not right, you're welcome. You're welcome for answering this sitting question. No, just a thank you there. So yeah, so if I'm right in saying that, so if that's not right, then just let me know that's not right. But a lordosis is a flexible, very flexible lumbar spine. So if you can see that, mine's not particularly, but it's kind of just normal. I suppose, well, normal. You know, it's not ultra mobile. But if I sort of push it there, you can see that the pelvis is tilting down, and my ribs stick out if I stick my bottom out, which I have to do, and that's essentially what your lordosis is doing. So what you need to work on is realigning. So it's essentially it's kind of the same process for everyone, but you'll all have a different needs depending on what it is that you're experiencing. So for lordosis, you need to bring that pelvis back, and it might even feel like you're tilting it under just to get that neutral feeling. And there's so many different exercises that you can do, like bringing the leg out into a lunge to kind of practice that, and then practice stacking the ribs on top of that pelvis, so we're getting a nice alignment. But essentially it's looking at alignment, which is going to help that bowel prolapse as well. And you might reduce the symptoms of the bowel prolapse. You're not necessarily going to reverse it, but you might, hopefully make it more manageable by looking at that. So let me just make sure there's no more questions. If anyone's got a quick question, then I will. I know I've gone over past 5:12. It's so easy to just talk about this. So if you've got to go, then brilliant, thank you. But I'm just going to give you, before you go, if you can wait 2 minutes if you want to, 3 things that you could do today to kind of get you started. And that is work on your feet. So lifting your big toes. I'm going to show you. So standing in, move this down. So standing in neutral position, see whether you can lift one big toe and then lift the other. That's your first bit of homework. That might not happen straight away, and don't be disheartened if it doesn't, but spend some time whenever you get chance, more time bare feet. If you're walking around your house, barefoot if you can, because that's going to be great sensory feedback, great for mobility of your foot in total. So it's a good place to start. So big toes. Walk more, and the best thing is we're now allowed to walk. We're now allowed out of the house more than once, so you can get in a couple of walks a day, or one big walk a day. So walk more than you are doing now, because that's going to really help. And the other thing is which I've talked about all throughout, is sitting on the floor. So if you can sit on the floor, especially at night. So if your routine, and we're all different, but if your routine is sitting on the sofa at night, reading or watching telly, or doing crafts, then sitting on the floor and just finding different ways. It doesn't have to be a particular way. So you can sit with your legs out to the side, you can sit with them out in front, but just spending a little bit more time holding your own body weight up. So not leaning against something rather than sitting in the sofa. So even just spending half an hour on the floor instead of that half an hour on the chair in the sofa and then getting on the sofa later is going to just open up your hips a little bit, start to wake up those muscles that perhaps aren't working, and also is just great for kind of bringing a bit more hip mobility in, which, you know, we all want. We're all getting older, so, you know, it's nice just to work on that hip mobility. So those are the 3 things. So that's it. I'm just going to check the chat just to make sure I've not missed anything. Yeah, oh, that's so common. So someone's just put, too scared to be away from the loo, so it stops me walking more. I know, I was exactly the same. And one of the things that helped me was going to see a women's health physio to understand what was going on. That actually, once I learned that my pelvic floor was strong, I started to trust it a bit more. So I kind of got that mind and body connection back and the trust back in my pelvic floor. But I'd say, you know, to start on the realignment, and if if you want to join me in my 8-week course, which starts in June, that's the place to start, really, is to start working on that and building up to it. But maybe just building up to walking distances and tell yourself that, start to trust your own body. But I totally get that. And yeah, to go out all of a sudden to walk isn't necessarily accessible for you. But maybe building it up, maybe just walking to somewhere that where there's a toilet. It was my tactic to start with. So if you walk to somewhere for 20 minutes or 10 minutes that there's a toilet, then you've done it, and it's building it up, a bit like an exercise regime. So have I got any more information on the course? What perfect timing? Yes, I'm not going to go into it all now because we've run over time, but it's starting on the 9th of June. So it's a live course, and it's running real time, and it's an 8-week course. What was the course I did? I'll come back to that in a minute. So it's an 8-week course, and each week we have a live call. So we have a group call where we all, we do a bit of pelvic floor safe yoga. So we get moving. We learn that week's exercise. So we start with the foundation exercises. Over the first 2 weeks, we do the 10 key foundation exercises, which are going to realign your body. And then each week we go through, so we learn about breathing, we learn about strengthening the glutes, hip strength and mobility, shoulder mobility, and releasing tension, how we can do that. And that's a great one because there's some brilliant poses, I guess you'd call them, that you can do whilst you're watching telly, and they're lying down, but they're actively releasing the pelvic floor. And then we in amongst that, we talk about each week a different thing that we can change and think about in our life. So I'll cover things like barefoot shoes. I'll cover all about, I call it body, it's called body cast. So wearing tight clothes, tight jeans, tight skirts, anything, underwire bras that are going to restrict the body's movement and ability to kind of move and function as it should do. And then we talk about, where's my piece of paper? Yeah, walking more, all the things that we can do, all the things I've covered. So total lifestyle changes. Yeah, so we do that over 8 weeks. Starts on the 9th of June. I'm going to email everybody after this webinar this morning with all the details, with the link to the website if you want to join. It's £97 for the 8 weeks if you book as an early bird, if you book by the end of May. And I only take, the maximum I'm going to take on this course is up to 20. So it might not be 20, but up to 20, because there is an opportunity to get personal feedback if you're sending in videos. So I want to be able to offer that personal feedback to you as well. So I think it's week 5 we did it this time, where once you've been working on your exercises, I ask you then to just record yourself doing those exercises, and then I provide you with a personal feedback video to sort of help you a bit further with alignment, so you can get specific advice. There's a Facebook group as well, so you can ask as many questions as you want. So throughout that 8 weeks, I'm totally here for you, to support you, to motivate you, and just to give you all the knowledge that I had to to help me. So, and someone just asked, what was the course that I did? So the course I did to train as the specialist was actually with someone called Claire Mockridge, who's a pelvic floor expert, Pilates teacher, and the